So basically I think it's about we all suffer life's challenges. Everybody has challenges in one way or another, huge or small, or usually huge at some point in your life. So the books say men have struggled over the past 200 years, and especially the last 100 have been super challenging to everybody. You know, there's been trauma after trauma after trauma. So, and male energy, the male energy that's been around for 20,000 years or more, 120,000, they think the Aborigines have been here. All that masculine energy, all those strengths of purpose and rituals and community and what have you, it got battered along the way in the last 100 years. I've called it challenges and choices from hurting to healing. Looking at, maybe you disagree with the whole premise, why men suffer, ways of healing, and what works for me. So my journey began about 30 years ago after the breakdown, and when I finally decided to come back into society, I met a psychologist, and she shared with me this quote from a man named Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau, and he went off and lived in the forest as well. And the quote was, "Most men lead lives of quiet desperation." This is a brilliant book by Steve Biddulph, and he's been doing men's health work for a long time. And if you're ever going to read one book, I'd say this is the one. It's just, there's something happens while you're reading it. And he talks about the rates of suffering. Men routinely fail at close relationships. Divorces are initiated by the woman in 4 out of 5 cases. Over 90% of the acts of violence are carried out by men, and 70% of the victims are men. In school, around 90% of children with behaviour problems are boys, and over 85% of children with learning problems are also boys. Men make up 80% of the homeless. Men comprise over 90% of jail populations. And the leading cause of death of men between 15 and 44 is self-inflicted. So for some reason, men suffer. So a question might be, can we agree we might have a problem? Yeah, and this is not just you men in the room, but men in general, especially the younger generation with their faces in their phones and their lack of actually speaking and meeting and doing meaningful things together. So the older we get, I think the more wisdom we seem to get, and the more you catch on to what is important in life. So the relationship to the father, Biddulph talks about a lot of the problems start with our relationship with our father. And maybe you've had a good childhood, maybe you had a tough one. He says the men's relationships to their fathers are basically dysfunctional, because only 30% of men have a good relationship with their father. 30% barely speak to their dads at all. Another 30%, they get along but they disagree when they sit together. Another 30%, they're well behaved with their dads, but out of a sense of duty. And he studied all the statistics, and he said 10% of men get on with their dads. Actually have a loving, kind, happy, really positive, supportive relationship. 10%. I just couldn't stand male authority, and I fought against it at every opportunity. So it got me into a lot of trouble. It cost me my career. So I try and live a bit more wisely these days. Respect everyone I meet. Men's enemies are often on the inside, in the walls we put up around our own hearts. And I've been looking into why this is. Why condition is that we're driven by fear, and we're driven by trying to avoid pain. In the old days, there'd be rituals of how for boys to become men. what challenges they had to go through to become men, to feel more confident, and yeah. So historically, in the early days, the Inuit people or the indigenous people, men would be on their own, or they'd be out in nature. They'd have this quiet time, this time to be and to think, as men seem to like, this time without interference. And so they had this natural alignment in nature and to themselves and to their purpose. And they could wait weeks to catch a seal. You had this natural connection to nature. And I just want to throw this in. I found this quote the other day. There's a man, not this man, but an Aborigine man who's been taking boys out into the desert for about 30 years or 40 years. And he said at the end of he takes the Aborigines and the Australian kids out. And he said at the end, the main message he likes to give them is that you are in this world to nurture and protect life. That's what men are for. So that's his main philosophy, to nurture and protect life. But about in the 1870s, was it, the Industrial Revolution hit, and the government organised so men couldn't own land. They were forced to go and get work in the mines and away from their families. They barely saw their families at all. And one of the problems was, of course, the boys were down the mines as well. They didn't get time with their dads. They didn't get the fathering. It broke the natural father to son, men to boys relationship that had been going for tens of thousands of years. So suddenly everyone's off, cold, miserable. They were forced from the land. 100 years ago, 90% of the men worked on the land. They had meaningful work. They did something and they saw something for it and they got a benefit for it. Now suddenly they're forced to go and work for someone else for a very measly wage. So it forced them away from centuries of connection to the earth and the land and away from the families and what I imagine is suddenly, instead of men serving their own well-being, the people they love, they're serving this machine. They're serving this massive thing which was supposed to improve our life, and perhaps it did, but in other ways it sort of broke a connection. And then we got hit by World War I. And they estimate in Britain alone 250,000 boys signed up and went off to the war. And I know in Australia, Gallipoli, a lot of the men left, didn't come back. So that was quite devastating as well. And then the boys didn't have their fathers again because the fathers were off at war. And World War I was pretty horrific. It's not easy to go back and look at the photos of how they lived and what they had to put up with. And we're affected by the past. It's still in us. It's in our society. It's in the way we think these days, the rules we make. And then we got hit by the Great Depression. I know my parents never talked about it, but they were so focused on what you earn, you save. Because there could be a time again when there's no work at all. Because they lived through this, or their parents lived through this. So they were very focused about what they thought was important, and perhaps there was a fear still there of what could happen next. So we just had World War I, now we can't get work, now we've got to leave our families and go and look for work, get your bread and soup. And I know some of my uncles just went walkabout looking for work or chasing gold and then World War II. If that wasn't enough, suddenly you got World War II. And people suffered in untold ways. My first father-in-law, he told me, I went to dinner and he'd never mentioned the war, and he said, it's been 50 years, it's time to tell some stories. And he told some pretty mild ones, but he felt like you don't talk about it. What happened doesn't get talked about. going on, and then I thought, well, we're still not out of that. It seems the war keeps going on. We're still in this conflicting thing of, and it seems to be getting, the children are getting involved. In the Middle East and what have you, there's these boys walking around with machine guns. And it wasn't until after the Vietnam War that the medical profession actually admitted that, yeah, if you put enough stress on men, they can break or get damaged. It wasn't until they come back from Vietnam and they just kept fighting for the fact that, you know, the gases had hurt them and the stress had hurt them. And I've been in Vietnam, and you see what was left of what happened with the Agent Orange and that. They never grew back. These stumps of, let alone what it did to the people and the people who were there, the people who came back, and the lack of support they got when they came back. So, in a way, men have been seen as expendable. They get sent off to war. Here's an old photo of men pruning trees. You know, if they fell to their death, that was just, you had to get another guy on board. I don't know how high up they are, but that's a pretty big tree. So men had jobs. You had to take what job you could get. And that ties in with that idea, boys should be tough, boys shouldn't cry, men should, you know, carry the load. And another thing that happened after the war was the men came back broken from the Second World War. There was this void of masculinity they talk about, that the women were really angry because the men weren't present anymore. They weren't men anymore. You know, and they turned to the boys and said to the boys, you've got to be the man of the house now. You've got to carry the load, you know. And then it made it very difficult for the boys growing up. And the displacement, these are modern photos, but the amount of people that had to leave Europe after the Second World War, or any war, and try and find a home somewhere else in the world. And one of the things that hit me when I was reading one of the books by a man called Bill Cowth, he started a thing called the Mankind Project. It's an international project where men meet and talk. Originally, he wrote, one thing we don't normally talk about is the shame the men felt after the Second World War, because they weren't warriors anymore. They weren't true warriors like the ancient, where you met a man. You had an equal chance of living or dying, yeah? There was some honour in it, and there'd been that honour in that warrior type for thousands of years, but suddenly you can just send a bomb miles away. And he said the men live with a shame, and shame doesn't get talked about. It just gets carried inside. You never get a chance. So I'm wondering if this is part of the thing where men don't want to talk, don't want to share, don't want to actually have a feeling. You know, I hated feelings. Probably led to my breakdown, because I wouldn't feel anything. I just drink more whiskey and, you know, and drink constantly. So trying to dull whatever it was that was in there. That's where I found the men's group so good, because you get a chance to talk. You get a chance to say what you're feeling, and the other guy goes, yeah, I can imagine that would hurt. You know. So this shame that came about after the war and carried on for many years. And he makes a comment, these men were like their fathers doing meaningless work, who were operating cold machines that delivered death miles away or miles below. And they suffered for it because they buried it deep, this horrible secret, and they buried it deep. And then it ended up, you know, the bombs being dropped on Japan. I think I saw a documentary where they firebombed cities. They just set the cities on fire before they dropped the big bombs. And I think, as far as I get it, we compartmentalise things. If we do something like that, oh yeah, put it in that box over there so I don't have to think about it again, I can get on with my life. And then it just popped up the other day, there was this period of prosperity when I was a kid. My dad had a job, he worked day and night, and my mum had a job and she got home before we got home from school. But they were able to build a house, they were able to buy a car, they were able to put us to school. So there was this sudden, and I was a kid so I don't really know what was going on, but And then I got a job in a factory when I was 14, and I work every Saturday, every school holidays. I work at night in the theatre. I work any jobs I could get. It came natural. You went to school and you had a job and got some money in your time off. Coming off, we had family picnics, we had plenty of food, we really had the good life. And then, I know for me, this came as a shock, the feminist movement in the 1970s. Suddenly the women started to say what they wanted. They weren't happy. And according to the psychology books, all the attention went to the women. So they assumed the men were okay, and then the schools and the psychology and the social workers, and they all just made sure women got a little bit more support. And I've been brought up, you have to walk on the street side of the gutter in case a car splashes, you have to open doors. I knew thousands of rules of how to treat a woman. And then like John Wayne and that told me you've got to be tough, you know. Rhett Butler, you know, keep your distance, woman, and I'm a male. So I had all this too going through my head, but it was like I had to learn a new set of rules because the women didn't like it when I opened the doors, and they didn't like it when I was polite to them, or, you know. I go, well, how the hell do you relate to a woman if the rules you were given aren't relevant anymore? And like this wasn't a new thing, because the suffragettes back in England, there's a thing that, where's the quote? 19th century men characteristically failed to notice female suffering. In this century, men have added another inattention. They characteristically failed to notice their own suffering.